The morning of March 7th, 1944. Over the skies of Berlin, Oberleutnant Heinz Knoke pulls his Messerschmitt Bf 109 into a climbing turn, his eyes scanning the contrails streaking across the pale winter sky. He has flown 172 combat missions. He has shot down 33 Allied aircraft. He knows these skies like a man knows his own heartbeat. And then he sees them, sleek, silver fighters with a profile he's been briefed about but never encountered. The new American escort fighter. The P-51 Mustang. In his memoirs, written years later, Knoke would recall his first thought upon seeing them. They look fast, but they're still just Americans. Within 6 minutes, 3 of his squadron mates would be dead. This is the story of how the Luftwaffe's most experienced fighter pilots, men who had dominated the skies over Poland, France, and Russia, convinced themselves that America's newest fighter was just another mediocre design from a nation that supposedly couldn't build proper combat aircraft. It's the story of a technological and tactical revolution that caught the German fighter force so completely off guard that by war's end, the P-51 Mustang would be credited with destroying more enemy aircraft than any other Allied fighter in the European theater. And it's the story of how professional contempt, born from years of genuine superiority, can become the most dangerous enemy of all. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The German fighter pilots who first heard about the P-51 Mustang in late 1943 had every reason to be confident. These were not arrogant amateurs. They were combat veterans who had earned their certainty through blood and mathematics. By the autumn of 1943, Luftwaffe fighter pilots on the Western Front had been shooting down American heavy bombers at rates that made the entire strategic bombing campaign appear unsustainable. On October 14, 1943, a date known in American Bomber Command as Black Thursday, the 8th Air Force lost 60 B-17 bombers over Schweinfurt. 60 aircraft, 600 men, in a single day. The mathematics were brutal and simple. American heavy bombers flying without fighter escort deep into German territory faced German fighters that could attack them at will. The Messerschmitt Bf 109 and the Focke-Wulf 190 were purpose-built interceptors, designed in the mid-1930s by engineers who understood that future wars would be decided by air superiority. These aircraft were fast, maneuverable, and, most critically, they were flown by pilots who had been fighting continuously since 1939. By 1943, a typical German fighter pilot on the Western Front had between 200 and 400 combat hours. Their American opponents, fresh from training in the United States, typically had fewer than 20 hours of actual combat time when they arrived in Europe. The Luftwaffe's confidence wasn't just cultural prejudice, though that certainly existed. It was built on a foundation of observable, measurable superiority. When the first American fighters attempted to escort bombers deep into Germany, the Germans watched with something approaching pity. The Republic Up-47 Thunderbolt, the primary American escort fighter in 1943, was a magnificent machine, heavily armed, ruggedly built, capable of absorbing tremendous punishment. But it had one fatal flaw for escort duty: range. With standard fuel tanks, the P-47 could barely reach the German border before having to turn back. This meant that American bomber formations flew the most dangerous portions of their missions, deep penetrations into German airspace, completely unescorted. German fighter tactics evolved to exploit this with surgical precision. Luftwaffe controllers would track incoming bomber formations using radar and visual observation networks that stretched across occupied Europe. They would identify the moment when the American escort fighters turned back, their fuel states forcing them home, and then the German fighters would attack. Major Heinz Baer, who would end the war with 220 confirmed victories, described the tactical situation in his post-war interrogation. "We would wait until their escort turned back, and then we had what we called a freie Jagd, a free hunt. The Americans were brave, but they were alone, and we were many." Into this dynamic came the first reports of a new American fighter. Intelligence briefings in late 1943 informed Luftwaffe pilots that the Americans were deploying a new long-range escort fighter designated the P-51. The reaction among German pilots was, according to multiple post-war accounts, dismissive. Hauptmann Johannes Steinhoff, an experienced fighter leader who would survive the war with 176 victories, recalled his squadron's briefing about the P-51. "We were told it was an American design with a British engine. This seemed to confirm everything we believed about Allied aircraft design. They couldn't even make their own engines work properly." This contempt had historical precedent. In 1942, the British had deployed the Mustang Mark I in the ground attack role, powered by an American Allison engine. It had been unimpressive, good at low altitude, but unable to compete with German fighters at the heights where bomber combat occurred. The Luftwaffe had encountered these early Mustangs and found them unremarkable. When intelligence briefings mentioned that the new P-51 was essentially the same airframe, many German pilots assumed it would be equally unimpressive. What those briefings failed to adequately communicate, or what German pilots failed to internalize, was the significance of one crucial modification. The Allison engine had been replaced with the British Rolls-Royce Merlin 61, manufactured under license in the United States as the Packard Vi 1650. The engine change transformed the aircraft completely. The Packard Merlin gave the P-51 exceptional performance at high altitude, where bomber combat occurred. But more importantly, it gave the Mustang range. With drop tanks, the P-51 could escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back, a round trip of more than 1,200 miles. This capability would fundamentally alter the air war over Europe. But in late 1943 and early 1944, German fighter pilots largely didn't believe it was possible. Oberleutnant Walter Krupinski, who survived the war with 197 victories, described the prevailing attitude in his fighter group. "We had been told many times about new American aircraft that would change the war. None of them had. The P-38 was supposed to be formidable. We shot them down. The P-47 was supposed to be invincible. We learned to avoid their strengths and exploit their weaknesses. When we heard about the P-51, we assumed it would be the same. Another American fighter with some advantages and many disadvantages." The German assessment wasn't entirely wrong about American aircraft design philosophy. American fighters were generally built around different priorities than German aircraft. The P-47, for example, was enormously heavy, over 14,000 pounds fully loaded, because American designers prioritized pilot protection, radio equipment, and multiple redundant systems. German fighters like the Bf-109 were lighter and, in some performance envelopes, more maneuverable, because German designers accepted greater risk to achieve pure performance. This philosophical difference had served the Luftwaffe well in the first years of the war. But the P-51 represented something different. It was an aircraft that, almost by accident, had been optimized for exactly the mission the Americans needed most desperately: long-range bomber escort at high altitude. The combination of the laminar flow wing design, which reduced drag, the efficient Merlin engine, and the carefully designed fuel system gave the Mustang a range that German intelligence analysts initially refused to believe. When the first P-51s appeared over German airspace in December 1943, many Luftwaffe pilots assumed they were operating from bases in Belgium or Holland, not from England. The idea that an American single-engine fighter could fly from England to central Germany seemed impossible. Major Günther Rall, who would end the war as the third highest-scoring fighter ace in history with 275 confirmed victories, recalled his first briefing about the P-51's capabilities. Our intelligence officer told us the Americans claimed this new fighter could escort bombers all the way to Berlin. Several of us laughed. We thought it was American propaganda, designed to make us worry about fighter cover where none existed. We had spent 4 years learning the range limitations of Allied fighters. We knew how far they could fly, or we thought we did. The certainty felt by German fighter pilots in late 1943 was the certainty of men who had tested their theories in combat and found them valid. They had learned, through hundreds of engagements, that American heavy bombers were vulnerable without fighter escort. They had learned that American escort fighters had limited range. They had learned that if they could avoid combat until the escorts turned back, they could attack the bombers with relative impunity. These weren't assumptions. These were facts, verified daily in the skies over Germany. And then, in the early months of 1944, those facts stopped being true. The first large-scale encounter between P-51 Mustangs and Luftwaffe fighters occurred on January 11, 1944, during a mission to Oschersleben and Halberstadt. The Mustangs of the 354th Fighter Group, flying their first bomber escort mission, engaged German fighters far deeper into German territory than should have been possible. Luftwaffe pilots who survived the engagement reported their encounters with confusion. These American fighters had appeared over central Germany. They had the altitude advantage, and they had stayed to fight, rather than turning back as P-47s would have been forced to do. Major Heinz Baer, leading elements of Jagdgeschwader 1, engaged what he assumed were P-47s that had somehow extended their range. In his combat report filed that evening, he noted, "The enemy fighters appeared to be a new type. They were highly maneuverable at altitude and pursued us aggressively even deep into German airspace. 2 of our aircraft were lost." This was unusual language for a German pilot of Baer's experience. He had been flying combat missions since 1939. He had fought over France, Britain, Russia, and Germany. The tone of uncertainty in his report suggested he had encountered something unexpected. But one engagement wasn't enough to change the prevailing assessment. The Luftwaffe High Command noted the appearance of the new American fighter, but didn't immediately grasp its strategic significance. Fighter pilots continued to operate under the tactical assumptions that had served them well for years. Avoid the escorts, wait for them to turn back, then attack the bombers. This strategy had worked for nearly 2 years. There was no immediate reason to believe it wouldn't continue to work. February 1944 brought the realization that something fundamental had changed. On February 20th, during a massive American raid against aircraft factories across Germany, P-51 Mustangs appeared in force for the first time, escorting bomber formations all the way to their targets and back. The engagement that day, later known as Big Week, involved over 1,000 American heavy bombers and more than 800 fighters. For the first time in the air war over Europe, American bombers had continuous fighter escort from England to the target and back. The Luftwaffe lost 61 fighters that day, not to bomber defensive fire, but to American escort fighters. Oberleutnant Heinz Knoke, whose encounter with P-51s over Berlin in March would nearly kill him, wrote in his diary after the February 20th mission, "Today we encountered something new. American fighters, appearing to be a modified version of the early Mustang, were present over the target. This should not be possible. The distance from England to our operational area exceeds the known range of any American single-engine fighter. Either our intelligence is wrong about their capabilities, or they have established forward bases we don't know about." The idea that German intelligence could be fundamentally wrong about Allied capabilities was difficult for Luftwaffe pilots to accept. These were men who had been taught, through their training and their experience, that German engineering and German tactical thinking were superior. The aircraft they flew, the Bf-109 and the Fw-190,
had dominated air combat over Poland, France, Russia, and the Mediterranean. When those aircraft had been bested, it was usually because of numerical superiority or tactical surprise, not because of superior enemy technology. The Messerschmitt Bf 109 that Heinz Knoke flew in March 1944 was not the same aircraft that had swept the skies over Poland in 1939. It was the G model, the Gustav, representing the culmination of nearly a decade of continuous refinement. The Gustav carried a 20-millimeter cannon firing through the propeller hub and two 13-millimeter machine guns mounted above the engine. It could reach altitudes above 39,000 feet. In the hands of an experienced pilot, it could outclimb almost any Allied fighter below 20,000 feet. But it was also heavier than earlier models, less maneuverable, and, critically, it had been designed for a different kind of war. The Bf 109 had been conceived in the mid-1930s as an interceptor to defend German airspace and a superiority fighter to support ground operations. It excelled at short, violent engagements, climbing quickly to intercept bombers, making a single devastating attack, then diving away to reset for another pass. What it had not been designed for was sustained combat against well-trained enemy fighters at high altitude. The Gustav's engine, the Daimler-Benz DB 605, performed beautifully up to about
20,000 feet. Above that altitude, its performance degraded. The Mustang's Merlin engine, with its two-stage supercharger, maintained excellent performance up to 30,000 feet and beyond. This technical difference mattered less than it might seem when fighting defensively over Germany. Luftwaffe pilots could choose their engagement altitudes, could dive to their aircraft's optimal performance envelope, could use ground controller guidance to position themselves advantageously. But it mattered enormously in terms of endurance. A Bf 109 carried about 88 gallons of internal fuel. Flying at combat power, burning fuel rapidly during climbs and high-speed maneuvers, a German fighter pilot had perhaps 45 to 50 minutes of combat operations before fuel concerns forced him to disengage. The P-51, even after dropping its external tanks at the first sign of combat, carried 184 gallons internally, more than twice the German fighter's capacity. This meant Mustang pilots could engage, disengage, re-engage, pursue, and generally dictate the terms of combat in ways that were new to the air war over Germany. Major Johannes Steinhoff, attempting to describe the change in his post-war memoir, wrote, "Previously, time was our ally. We could attack, dive away, climb back to altitude, and attack again. The Americans could not follow us indefinitely. They had to shepherd their bombers, and they had fuel concerns. But with the Mustang, suddenly time was our enemy. They could stay with us. They could pursue us. We were burning fuel rapidly. They were burning it slowly. Every minute of combat favored them." The 650 caliber machine guns that gave the Mustang its devastating punch were arranged with 4 in the wings and 2 in the fuselage on early models, or all 6 in the wings on later production aircraft. Each gun carried approximately 400 rounds, a total of 2,400 rounds of ammunition. This was considerably more than the Bf 109's armament, which carried about 200 rounds for the cannon and roughly 300 rounds per machine gun. But the real difference wasn't in quantity. It was in effectiveness at different ranges and against different target types. The German 20-millimeter cannon was devastating when it hit. A single cannon shell could shred a bomber's wing, explode a fuel tank, or kill a crew member even through the bomber's armor. But the cannon had a relatively slow rate of fire, about 650 rounds per minute, and a curved trajectory that required precise range estimation. It was optimized for attacking large, slow-moving bombers, not fast, maneuvering fighters. The Mustang's 50 caliber machine guns, by contrast, fired at roughly 800 rounds per minute each, a combined rate of nearly 4,800 rounds per minute. They had a flatter trajectory, making them easier to aim, and while individually less destructive than cannon shells, The sheer volume of fire was overwhelming. Captain Don Gentile of the 4th Fighter Group, who would become one of the war's leading Mustang aces with 21.5 confirmed victories by April 1944, described engaging a Bf-109 in March. I got on his tail at about 25,000 feet. He tried to dive away, but the Mustang followed him down easily. I opened fire at about 300 yards and walked my fire into him. I could see the .50 caliber rounds hitting all along his fuselage and wings. He tried to pull up into a climb, but by then I'd probably put 200 rounds into him. His engine started smoking, then he rolled over and bailed out. What Gentile's account reveals, what many such accounts reveal, is the Mustang's ability to maintain sustained fire at ranges and angles where German fighters had to carefully husband their limited ammunition. A Bf-109 pilot, knowing he had perhaps 10 seconds of cannon fire available, had to choose his shots carefully. A Mustang pilot could engage earlier, could correct his aim with bursts of tracer fire, could maintain pressure during maneuvering combat. This difference in fighting philosophy, conservative ammunition management versus sustained fire, became one of the Mustang's most significant tactical advantages. The Focke-Wulf 190, the Luftwaffe's other primary fighter, presented different challenges and opportunities. Introduced in 1941, the Würger or Shrike had been a revelation. A radial engine fighter that could outdive and outroll the Spitfire Mark V, the RAF's primary fighter at the time. The Anton model, which equipped most units in early 1944, was heavier and more ruggedly built than the Bf-109. It carried 4 20mm cannons and 2 machine guns in some configurations, making it a devastating bomber destroyer. But against the Mustang, the FW-190 faced challenges similar to those encountered by the Bf-109, with an additional complication. The BMW radial engine was powerful but thirsty. Fuel consumption at combat power was even worse than the Bf-109, giving FW-190 pilots perhaps 40 minutes of combat operations. Major Gerhard Barkhorn, who flew extensively against Mustangs in the war's final year after transferring from the Eastern Front, observed, "The FW-190 was an excellent aircraft for attacking bombers. Stable gun platform, heavy armament, could absorb damage, but in a turning fight with a Mustang you were at a disadvantage. They could turn with you, they could outclimb you above 20,000 feet, and they could chase you until you ran out of fuel." The tactical doctrine that German fighter pilots had refined over years of combat centered on boom and zoom attacks, diving from altitude, making a high-speed pass, then climbing back to altitude before the enemy could respond effectively. This worked brilliantly against bombers and against early Allied escort fighters with limited climb performance. But the Mustang could climb nearly as fast as the German fighters, could maintain high speed in a climb, and, most problematically, could pursue the German fighters through multiple attack cycles. Oberleutnant Walter Krupinski, leading a Staffel of Bf-109s in March 1944, filed a combat report that captured the frustration. "We made our approach from above the bombers, diving through the formation to make a single pass before climbing back to altitude. We were engaged by what appeared to be P-51 aircraft during our climb. Normally, enemy escort fighters cannot maintain pursuit during a high-speed climb. They fall behind, and we can reset our position. But these aircraft matched our climb rate and pursued us aggressively. We were forced to engage them rather than making another pass at the bombers. In the resulting combat, we lost 2 aircraft without inflicting any apparent damage on the enemy fighters." This was the tactical revolution that German fighter pilots were slow to recognize. The Mustang didn't just escort bombers, it actively hunted German fighters. Previous American escort fighters had flown close formation with the bombers, responding to attacks but generally remaining tied to the bomber stream. Mustang pilots, with the range to accompany bombers throughout the mission and the performance to engage German fighters on equal or superior terms, began to operate more aggressively. General James Doolittle, who took command of the 8th Air Force in January 1944, had modified escort fighter doctrine specifically to exploit the Mustang's capabilities. Instead of requiring fighters to stay close to the bombers, Doolittle authorized fighter groups to range ahead of the bomber stream to pursue German fighters aggressively and to seek combat rather than simply responding to it. This shift, combined with the Mustang's technical capabilities, created a situation where Luftwaffe fighters faced continuous fighter opposition from the moment Allied formations crossed into German airspace until they departed. The morning of March 6, 1944, brought the first American raid against Berlin itself, a deliberate challenge to the Luftwaffe's ability to defend the Reich capital. More than 600 bombers, escorted by 800 fighters, many of them P-51 Mustangs, struck targets in and around Berlin. The Luftwaffe responded with everything available. Over 300 fighters rose to meet the American formation. The combat that day lasted for hours, from the German coast to Berlin and back. Luftwaffe fighters attacked in waves, attempting to overwhelm the escorts and reach the bombers. But the escorts didn't turn back. They didn't run out of fuel and abandon the bombers to their fate. They stayed and they fought and they pursued German fighters deep into German airspace. The Luftwaffe lost 69 fighters that day, the highest single-day loss for the Luftwaffe since the Battle of Britain nearly 4 years earlier. American losses were 69 bombers and 11 fighters. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. For Luftwaffe pilots, the Berlin raid was a revelation and a disaster. Heinz Knoke, flying his third mission that day, described the chaos in his diary. "We are overwhelmed. Not by numbers alone, we have faced numerical superiority many times, but by the presence of enemy fighters everywhere, at all altitudes, throughout the entire mission. There is nowhere safe, no moment to reset, no opportunity to attack the bombers without fighting through their escorts first. And their escorts are good, very good." The next day, March 7th, brought another raid on Berlin. This was the mission where Knoke would have his first direct encounter with a P-51 Mustang. His account, written that evening while the details were still fresh, provides a window into the psychological impact of fighting an enemy you had underestimated. Knoke had taken off from Oldenburg at 11:30 in the morning, leading a formation of 8 Bf-109s. Ground controllers vectored them toward a bomber formation approaching from the northwest. The plan was standard: climb to altitude above the bombers, assess the escort situation, attack from altitude advantage. As Knoke's formation climbed through 28,000 feet, he saw the bombers below, B-17 flying fortresses in their characteristic box formations. And above the bombers, perhaps 2,000 feet higher, he saw the silver glint of escort fighters. In his diary, Knoke wrote, "I assumed they were P-47s, flying top cover for the bombers. We maintained our climb, intending to attack from above the escorts. But as we climbed through 30,000 feet, the escorts climbed with us. This was unusual. P-47s generally did not operate effectively above 28,000 feet. As we leveled off at 32,000 feet, preparing to roll into our attack, the escorts were still above us." What happened next would reshape Knoke's understanding of the air war. As his formation began their diving attack toward the bombers, the escorts, which Knoke now recognized as P-51s, rolled over and dove to intercept. The closing speed was enormous, both formations diving at high speed toward each other. Knoke's formation split, some aircraft continuing toward the bombers, others turning to engage the fighters. Knoke chose to engage. He pulled his Bf-109 into a climbing turn, attempting to position himself behind one of the Mustangs. But the Mustang matched his turn, tightened its turn radius, and reversed direction. Faster than Knoke expected. Within seconds, Knoke found himself defensive, trying to shake a Mustang that had gotten behind him. He described the next moments. I dove, attempting to use my aircraft's superior dive speed. The American followed. I pulled into a steep climb, our standard escape maneuver. The American followed. I could see his tracers passing just behind my aircraft. I rolled violently right, then left, trying to spoil his aim. He stayed with me. This continued for what felt like several minutes, but was probably less than one. I was burning fuel at an enormous rate. My fuel gauge was dropping rapidly. Finally, I dove straight down at full throttle and headed for cloud cover at low altitude. He pursued for perhaps 30 seconds, then broke off. When I landed at Oldenburg 20 minutes later, I had fuel for perhaps 5 more minutes of flight. 3 of the 8 aircraft in Noki's formation did not return from that mission. 1 pilot bailed out over German territory. 2 were killed. Noak's combat report, filed that evening, marked a significant departure from his previous assessments. The new American fighter, designated P-51, represents a serious threat to our operations. It performs well at high altitude, has excellent maneuverability, and appears to have significantly greater range than previous American escort fighters. We were engaged over Berlin and pursued nearly to the coast. This should not be possible, but it happened. Similar reports were flooding into Luftwaffe headquarters throughout March and April 1944. Major Johannes Steinhoff, after losing 4 pilots in a single engagement with Mustangs near Brunswick, wrote a lengthy tactical analysis for his Geschwader. We must revise our tactical doctrine. The enemy fighter escort is no longer constrained by range limitations. They can engage us at any point in the mission. They will pursue us aggressively. Our previous advantage, the ability to choose when and where to engage, has been largely negated. The statistics were stark and undeniable. In January 1944, before P-51s appeared in significant numbers, the Luftwaffe had lost 158 fighters defending against American bomber raids. In February, with P-51s becoming more numerous, losses increased to 262. In March, with P-51s dominating the escort role, Luftwaffe fighter losses exceeded 350 aircraft. April would be worse. 514 German fighters lost. These weren't just numbers. They were pilots. By mid-1944, the Luftwaffe's pilot training program was in crisis. It took 6 months to a year to train a competent fighter pilot in peacetime. The Luftwaffe, fighting on multiple fronts with fuel shortages and constant Allied bombing of training facilities, was producing pilots with perhaps 30 to 50 hours of flight training, barely enough to take off and land safely, much less engage veteran Allied fighter pilots in combat. Major Günther Rahl, who commanded various fighter units throughout this period, observed the deterioration. We were sending boys into combat against experienced American and British pilots. Our boys had perhaps 50 hours in the aircraft. The Americans they faced had 200 hours or more. Our boys were flying an aircraft that, while excellent, were being maintained with increasingly scarce parts and fuel. The Americans were flying new aircraft, properly maintained with ample fuel and ammunition. The mathematics of survival were not in our favor. The claim that P-51s shredded 50 Me-109s in specific engagements is difficult to verify with precision. Combat claims are notoriously unreliable, with overclaiming common on all sides. But the cumulative effect is undeniable. Between January and May 1944, P-51 Mustangs were credited with destroying more than 1,200 German aircraft in air-to-air combat. Many of these were indeed Bf-109s, the Me-109 in Allied terminology, though Germans called it simply the 109 or Gustav for the G model. One particularly devastating engagement occurred on April 8, 1944, during a raid on aircraft factories in Brunswick and other targets. The 8th Air Force dispatched more than 1,100 bombers and 900 fighters, the largest force yet assembled. the Luftwaffe responded with approximately 300 fighters. In the running battles that developed across northern Germany, P-51 Mustangs were credited with shooting down 61 German fighters. Total Luftwaffe losses that day exceeded 100 aircraft, with many more damaged. Captain Don Gentile, flying with the 4th Fighter Group, claimed 3 Bf-109s destroyed that day. His combat report describes pursuing a formation of German fighters after they'd broken off from an attack on the bombers. We chased them down from 28,000 feet to the deck. Every time they tried to turn and engage, we had the altitude or speed advantage. I got one in a diving turn, just held the trigger down and watched the strikes walk up his fuselage. He exploded. Got another one as he tried to zoom climb back to altitude. His engine was smoking before he made it halfway up. The third one was trying to disengage at low altitude. I caught him from his 7 o'clock high, came down on him fast, and hit him with a long burst. He went into the ground. The language in Gentile's report is, matter of fact, almost casual, but it describes a level of dominance that would have been unthinkable a year earlier. German fighter pilots who had ruled the skies over Europe for years were being hunted in their own airspace by American pilots flying an aircraft that German intelligence had initially dismissed as another mediocre American design. By May 1944, the Luftwaffe's fighter force was in effective collapse as a defensive force. Not because German pilots lacked courage. They continued to press home attacks with extraordinary bravery, even in hopeless situations. Not because German aircraft were obsolete. The Bf-109 and FAW-190 remained competitive aircraft in the hands of experienced pilots. But because the fundamental tactical situation had changed in ways that German doctrine couldn't adapt to quickly enough. Oberleutnant Heinz Knoke, whose near-death encounter with a Mustang in March had shaken him badly, continued flying missions through April and May. His diary entries from this period make for difficult reading. April 15th. Another disaster. Lost 5 aircraft today, no bomber kills to show for it. April 22nd. We are no longer hunting the bombers. We are being hunted. May 8th. I am exhausted. We fly 3, sometimes 4 missions per day. Every mission, we lose aircraft. The American fighters are everywhere. Knoke would survive the war, but barely. Shot down 4 times, wounded twice, he ended the war with 33 confirmed victories. A respectable total by any measure. But his diary reveals the psychological toll of fighting an air war that had shifted from one of German superiority to one of desperate defense against an enemy with superior numbers, superior logistics, and, most painful for German pilots to admit, aircraft that were, in many respects, superior. Major Johannes Steinhoff, one of the Luftwaffe's most capable tactical leaders, attempted to develop new doctrine to counter the Mustang threat. His proposals included abandoning high-altitude intercepts in favor of low-altitude approaches that might negate the Mustang's altitude advantage, using cloud cover more aggressively to break contact, and, most desperately, advocating for ramming attacks against bombers by volunteer pilots willing to sacrifice their aircraft and likely their lives to ensure kills. Some of these tactics were tried. None proved effective in the long term. The fundamental problem wasn't tactical, it was strategic. The Luftwaffe was burning through pilots and aircraft faster than they could be replaced. The Americans were producing 50 Mustangs for every Bf-109 the Germans manufactured. American pilots received thorough training. German pilots arrived at the front with minimal preparation. American fighters operated with ample fuel and ammunition. German fighters increasingly flew with partial fuel loads to conserve dwindling reserves. By June 1944, when the Allied invasion of Normandy began, the Luftwaffe's fighter force was a shadow of what it had been 6 months earlier. On D-Day, June 6, 1944, the Luftwaffe managed to fly exactly 2 combat sorties over the invasion beaches. 2.
The Air Force that had terrorized Poland, France, and Britain could barely put aircraft in the sky when the Allies staged the largest amphibious invasion
in history. The P-51 Mustang was not solely responsible for this collapse. The campaign involved strategic bombing of German fuel production, intensive attacks on Luftwaffe airfields, and the cumulative attrition of years of multi-front warfare. But the Mustang was the weapon that made deep penetration bombing possible, that turned the air war over Germany from a costly stalemate into a systematic destruction of the Luftwaffe's fighter force. General Adolf Galland, who commanded the Luftwaffe's fighter forces through this period, wrote in his post-war memoir, "The appearance of the Mustang changed everything. We could no longer predict where enemy fighters would be or for how long they would remain. We could no longer maneuver to avoid them. They came to our airfields. They hunted us." The pilots who flew the Mustang were not inherently superior to our pilots. Courage and skill were distributed equally. But they flew an aircraft that was, for the mission of bomber escort and air superiority over Germany, nearly perfect, and they came in numbers we could not match. Galland's assessment, from a man who had fought the RAF over Britain and commanded thousands of fighter pilots through the war's final years, represents perhaps the clearest German acknowledgement of the Mustang's impact. The aircraft that Luftwaffe pilots had initially dismissed, just another American fighter with some British engine, had become the weapon that broke the Luftwaffe's back. The numbers tell a story of systematic destruction. From January to May 1944, the Luftwaffe lost approximately 2,600 fighters defending against American bomber raids, an average of more than 500 aircraft per month. Pilot losses during the same period exceeded 1,000 killed or missing, with hundreds more wounded. These casualties fell disproportionately on experienced pilots, the Experten who knew how to fight and survive. Each month, the Luftwaffe's pilot corps became younger, less experienced, more vulnerable. Heinz Knoke's diary entry from May 30th, 1944, captures the sense of exhausted defeat. "We continue to fly, continue to fight, but we are no longer winning. The Americans come every day, sometimes twice a day. Their fighters swarm over Germany like angry bees. We shoot some down, but they are replaced immediately. When we lose an aircraft, it is gone forever. When we lose a pilot, he cannot be replaced. I have flown 235 combat missions. I have survived this long through skill, luck, and the mercy of God. But I look at the new pilots arriving at our field, boys of 19 or 20 with perhaps 40 hours in the aircraft, and I know they will not survive. The best of them might last a week. Most will be dead in days." The final irony, perhaps the greatest irony, is that the Luftwaffe's initial dismissal of the Mustang was not entirely unreasonable. The early Mustang, with its Allison engine, had been unimpressive. German intelligence reports about Allied aircraft were generally accurate. German pilots' confidence in their own aircraft and tactics was justified by years of successful combat. Every element of their assessment was based on rational analysis of available information. What they failed to anticipate, what perhaps they couldn't have anticipated, was the combination of factors that made the P-51 so effective. The pairing of the Merlin engine with the Mustang airframe was not the result of brilliant strategic planning, but rather a somewhat fortuitous marriage of British engine technology with American airframe design. The result was an aircraft that happened to excel at exactly the mission profile the Americans needed most: long-range bomber escort at high altitude. Moreover, the Mustang arrived at a specific moment in the war when German defensive capabilities were stretched to breaking. Had it appeared a year earlier, when the Luftwaffe had more experienced pilots and adequate fuel reserves, the outcome might have been different. Had it appeared a year later, when Germany was already collapsing under the weight of a two-front war, it would have been unnecessary. But it arrived in early 1944, at the precise moment when the air war's outcome hung in balance.
and it tipped that balance decisively in favor of the Allies. Captain Chuck Yeager, who would later become the first pilot to break the sound barrier, flew P-51 Mustangs with the 357th Fighter Group in 1944. In his autobiography, he described the experience of flying bomber escort missions over Germany. The Germans were good pilots, brave men, skilled in their aircraft, but we had advantages they couldn't overcome. We could fly further, stay longer, and press the fight. Every mission we went hunting. Every mission we found them. They had nowhere to hide, nowhere to rest, nowhere to rebuild. It wasn't that we were better pilots, though we were well trained. It was that we had the better aircraft for the job, and we had enough of them. By war's end in May 1945, P-51 Mustangs had been credited with destroying 4,950 enemy aircraft in air-to-air combat, more than any other Allied fighter type in the European theater. These victories came at a cost. Operational losses, including aircraft lost to all causes, exceeded 2,000 Mustangs. But the Americans could afford those losses. They produced more than 15,000 P-51s during the war. The Germans, producing approximately 30,000 Bf-109s throughout the entire war across all fronts, could not sustain the attrition rates of 1944. Heinz Knoke survived the war, as did Johannes Steinhoff, Walter Krupinski, and Günter Rall. All four men wrote memoirs or gave extensive interviews about their experiences. All four, in different ways, acknowledged that the P-51 Mustang represented a turning point, not because it made German pilots suddenly incompetent, but because it made their tactical situation untenable. Knoke, in his memoir I Flew for the Fuhrer, published in 1953, wrote, "We mocked the Americans when we first heard about their new fighter. We had defeated everything they had sent against us. We assumed this would be no different. We were wrong. The P-51 was different. Not because it was invincible. We shot many of them down, but because it could go everywhere we went, stay as long as we stayed, and fight on equal or better terms. For the first time, we were not the hunters. We were the hunted." The story of the Luftwaffe's encounter with the P-51 Mustang is not primarily a story about aircraft specifications or technical capabilities, though those matter. It's a story about how professional militaries can be surprised by changes in technology and tactics that render their hard-won expertise obsolete. It's a story about how confidence, born from years of genuine superiority, can blind even intelligent, experienced professionals to emerging threats. Most of all, it's a story about the brutal mathematics of industrial warfare. The Luftwaffe's pilots were individually as skilled and brave as any pilots in history. The aircraft they flew were sophisticated, well-designed machines. But they faced an enemy with greater industrial capacity, better logistics, more pilots, more aircraft, and crucially, a technological solution to the bomber escort problem that came online at exactly the moment it was needed most. The Luftwaffe aces who mocked the P-51 in late 1943 had earned their contempt through 4 years of combat success. Their mistake was not stupidity or arrogance. It was the natural human tendency to assume that the future will resemble the past. They had learned through bitter experience what Allied fighters could and couldn't do. When intelligence reports suggested a new Allied fighter that violated those learned limitations, they didn't believe it. By the time they understood their error, it was too late. The air war over Europe had fundamentally changed, and the Luftwaffe's fighter force would never recover. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.